in honor of St. Patrick's Day, we're very happy to have some historical context on the mining Irish Americans in the West. So we have with us Alan Noonan, who is an independent historian from Cork, Ireland, and the inaugural historian in residence for Cork City Libraries. He got his PhD from University College Cork in 2013 and has received several prestigious fellowships, including the Glucksman Government of Ireland Fellowship at New York University and the Kluge Fellowship at the Library of Congress. He's also written extensively on migration, American social and cultural history, the Irish diaspora, and is an advocate for public history, and has written and narrated 2 podcasts, the Garda History podcast and the Cork Docklands History podcast. So we're very happy to have Ellen with us to speak tonight.
I suppose we might as well start off with Irish. It seems appropriate. Thank you all very much for being here. It's lovely to see that the study and learning of history is still so proudly endorsed here. This is wonderful to see so many people here. My thanks to Laura and the Montana Historical Society as well for inviting me to talk about my book, Mining Irish American Lives, Western Communities from 1849 to 1920. It is always a terrible shame when an author has to look at the title of his own book. But you have to remember that you're trying to keep on to an awful lot of information in the head, so it takes a bit of a time. What I'm going to talk about tonight is several exciting sections that I have not been able to include in my book, some more details of letters, and the letters form part of the cornerstone of my book. But I suppose in the overall assessment, what I'd like to say about the book generally is that it makes 3 main interventions on American Western historiography and also in the field of Irish studies. And those 3 interventions are, firstly, it's a complete reassessment of the statistical analysis of populations in the American West. Boiling that down, it basically means that the Irish communities and actually other ethnic communities in the American West have been undercounted by previous historians by about 50 and 60%. The measures that I use to assess how large ethnic communities were include the children of those ethnic communities, which makes an awful lot of sense if you think about it, because, you know, if you're born to both parents being Irish, you learn from both of your parents and you grow up culturally Irish and American. Now, what exactly that term means, we'll delve into a little bit later. That hyphen in the title of my book is a very important little part of what it is that I'm talking about, but we'll deal about that a little bit later. The second main assessment that I make, or intervention that I make in the book, is it's a reassessment of the influence, organization, and persistence of those Irish communities throughout the American West. The third intervention is that this book develops a framework for understanding those complex fissures and fusions within the Irish community, and then also with other ethnic groups, Americans, that is to say, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Native Americans, Chinese, Cornish, Welsh, Germans, Italians, to name but a few. The American West in the 19th century was a very diverse place, a vast milieu of different peoples. And again, the book talks an awful lot about those encounters between different peoples and how exactly they all got on. So, the cornerstone and the start of this whole book project began with the discovery of emigrant letters. And I found some emigrant letters in the attics of people's houses. They'd been storing for decades. Some I found in distant archives scattered throughout the American West, and in various other archives as well. Emigrant letters demonstrate the overall Irish emigrant experience, and I use them to talk about different themes in the book: homesickness, loneliness, the permanence of emigration, and the flow of money back to Ireland. Those are kind of going to be the main things that I'm going to talk about this evening. And it's been a big part of the book to try and recover the voices of these people. The emigrant letters are one of the wonderful sources for really having these people talk about their own experiences in their lives, both the men and women who had this emigrant experience. It's a rich source for social and cultural historians, and as I said, I'll showcase a few of them and we'll talk through a few of them. The first one I'm starting off with is just a quick quote, which is from Bartholomew Colgan, Carson City, Nevada territory, and he's writing to a relative, Thomas Dunny, over in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is on 13th of June, 1862. It's just a little clip. And he writes, There is nothing that gives me greater pleasure than to get letters from my friends, even if they are short ones. And maybe that holds true to today. But of course, back in the 19th century, you have to remember the context, the cost of sending post, the effort it took to sit down and write a letter, the hope that it was actually going to reach its destination. In the era of instant communication, it's very easy for us to shoot a little text or whatever, but think of it back then. We're going to be looking at other little clips here, but I want to pause on this picture. This picture is a painting and one that I include as an illustration in the book. I won't dwell on it too much, except to say that in the 1850s and 60s, an awful lot of these emigrant letters that would have been coming home to Ireland is displaying this sort of scene, where a child who would have been sent to public education, and I suppose in the mid-19th century maybe they were one and the same, but public education, and of course this was part of British imperial policy of cultural eradication of the Irish language and Irish culture, but it still did mean that the Irish, mostly some, entered America being able to speak and write English, and so they would also mostly write back in English. Now the families back home didn't always speak or read English, and so often it was the children who would read to the families at these table sides for the other relatives. So that's a scene that you're looking at right there. Now, this is from James Malani in the Idaho Territory, and he's writing to his sister, again over in Philadelphia. They're both second-generation Irish. Once more do I engage in the pleasing task of conferring with dear and absent friends in the hopes to revive in them a kindred spirit. I have looked with no little anxiety for each successive mail in hopes that it would bring me some glad tidings from you, but the arrival of each one only doomed me to more disappointment. But still, I have not despaired that you have given up on me yet for lost. I shall still hope on forever. And in that letter, it didn't come out quite well enough, but it's enough to emphasize the point. He ends it with 3 words: please write soon. You can imagine the weight of ending a letter. Remember, paper was precious as well to be sending back and forth. They'd sometimes even write a letter over the letter and send that back. But please write soon, that emphasis on trying to get a letter and send it back to them. That was a 7-page letter. Another early immigrant to the Californian goldfields returned to the city of San Francisco, finding that there was no mail waiting for him. He had gone beyond feeling any sense of ingratitude when he wrote to his family, "What was my disappointment not to find one? I have arrived to the conclusion that you may as well as the rest of the folks have forgotten that there is a such thing as being as Pick Mac. And this is the last time I will put you in mind of the fact that there is such a fellow living." So he was laying it on fairly thick there with the guilt in that particular letter. Now, there's the distinct fact that he was probably hoping that that might help them write more regularly. But you have to remember as well that these immigrants were often moving from place to place. The Irish immigrant story in America frequently focuses on New York, Chicago, Boston. But in actual fact, an awful lot of the immigrants were moving around from place to place, seeking opportunity, following various lines of news from other immigrants or family members that were traveling around the place. And so their mobility, often in search of work, frequently hampered 19th century communication, both in the receiving of letters and that of sitting down, writing, and sending them. Writing to his brother, James Gamble wrote, "I have wrote no letter these past 4 years," and he added that the cause was tied to a certain bitterness, that as well as family not writing, "nor have I gotten any notes from my friends." He followed his letter explaining that, "The reason of me not writing sooner, I have been living far away from the post office." And embedded in that little sort of reference is obviously a little snide allusion to the people back in Ireland who were significantly closer to a post office rather than maybe 100 miles away, which is quite easy over in different parts of America. This next letter I'd like to read for you. I only use a portion of these letters in the text, but I selected a different part of the letters to read to you today. So, the delays were often frequently caused by tragedy, and one sister wrote to a brother with terrible news, "Dear brother, you must excuse me for not writing to you sooner, but the day I received your letter, one of my children was on her deathbed. She was 4 years old and the pride of the house. She was 4 weeks sick and never complained, and she was better and spoke to the last moment. She died of dropsy. Her name was Ellen." The weight of each word lies heavy on the paper, signifying an unspeakable degree of suffering. Ellen Wogan, the woman who wrote that, replied to her brother's inquiries about his friends and wrote the following line: "Dear brother, you would like to hear from all your old schoolfellows. There is not one here that I know of. They are all dead and scattered away." If you want to look at a similar sort of comparative story within the book, I recommend inside in chapter 2, the John Orr chapter, where I talk about an Irish emigrant who travels from Portadown over to California, joins in the gold rush, becomes very disillusioned at the gold mining, ends up going into a bit of agriculture and haymaking, and eventually a letter arrives up in Portadown from his business partner. And the letter that is returned back from Ireland indicates what exactly has happened. That letter starts off, "When we heard the news of our son's death, it broke upon us like a thunderstorm." And again, you can imagine the force of this, not knowing what's happening to somebody over there. The parents of John Orr continue saying that your letter gave us Christian composure and comforted us greatly. So again, these ideas of the news, the communication network, the importance of hearing from family members of what exactly happened. William Kennedy wrote to his cousin, John Gilmore, in County Down in 1879 and asked, "I have not had a letter from home now, from any one of our family for more than a year. Isabella used to correspond with me regularly until lately, and I fear very much either she has been sick or dead. The latter, I fear." Reverend O'Hanlon, who wrote the Irish Emigrant's Guide to Emigration, he advised, and it's kind of a textbook to reading if you're preparing for the emigrant experience, but he advised that in all cases in which Catholics, and of course he was speaking particularly to the Catholic Irish emigrants, in all cases in which Catholics meditate removal to a remote and partially settled country, and I presume we can all think about maybe Montana in the 1860s and 1870s as being such a place, we would advise the formation of companies and colonies, not so much for the purposes of mutual protection and assistance in encountering the dangers of wilderness and its colonization, as to obtain for themselves the spiritual succor they require, which, under other circumstances, cannot often be procured. Right, so you have a priest warning about the dangers of spiritual isolation on the frontier. And it's fair enough that a priest would be warning about that, but the Irish emigrants themselves were often fearful of that very peculiarity, even though it didn't necessarily stop them from going into the frontier. American Protestant observers saw this as a sort of rejection of the American spirit of independence, of this reinvention on the frontier. And obviously Irish immigrants to the American West were immediately resistant to this idea of reinvention. The Irish emphasis was much more on community and religion, and that popular sort of misconception of what it was, and I'll explain why it is a misconception of this particular time in a second, but an Irish Protestant, Godkin, probably put that historical inaccuracy as succinctly as possible. He said that the church, the Catholic Church that is, was vehemently opposed to emigration to the West, since they, that is the Irish, are more difficult for the church to control when so scattered. Okay, fair enough. I don't know if the British would necessarily agree with that assessment back home in Ireland, but still, you can see Godkin looking at this sort of hierarchical sort of structure, thinking of a sort of slavish popery. But for the Irish, if the church sought to control them, then the Irish happily demanded the instruments of their control, priests. They would constantly write letters to the seminaries looking for priests, in particular back home in Ireland. And more important than that, they would often get Irish priests being sent out to this frontier land. Chapter 2 talks about Reverend Toomey, who grew up near where I'm from, near Macroom, and ended up over in Smartsville, California. Wow. And so he's over there in Smartsville, California, and he writes this letter in the interment book, a wonderful document that's inside the diocese archives, inside in, over in California. What's the state capital of California? Sacramento. Excellent, you all did your geography. Sacramento, thank you very much. So this is a quote from that. He's talking about Patrick Galligan, 60, 18, and this is an entry from 1888. He was found dead in his cabin, seemed to have been dead a couple of days, and consequently he did not receive the last rites of the church. It was a clear example of how one should always be prepared and of how dangerous it is to live alone and remote from assistance. Again, the focus was much more on this idea of making sure that they got last rites, making sure that they had that connection before they passed on. And Toomey, as well as other Irish priests throughout the American West, would travel 20, 30, 40 miles an evening to get to an isolated parishioner who was out in the prospecting in the distant countryside. And in fact, poor Father Toomey, he ended up, the final entry for him in the interment book is his own, where he's traveling to an isolated miner who's off in one of the distant hills, and he's fording a river in effect. His cart topples over and he's drowned underneath it at a very young age. He's only 37, I believe. But quite interesting to see somebody entering into the interment records, and then he himself is entered in. There's one thing when we're talking about these dangers of the mines and dangers of the frontier. One story I came across, which was wonderful, and it was reprinted in Irish newspapers as well. Unfortunately, it's your own glorious locality. It is the Helena's Montana Republican. And it prints a story about some dangers in the American West for potential Irish immigrants. And this story was printed with the title, Horrible Story from the Far West. 1866. In May, a man representing himself to be a minister of the gospel stopped at an Irishman's ranch in Tobacco Plains on the road from Pandoria Lake to Kootenay Mines. And that sometime afterwards, the Irishman was missing, and the quondam preacher stepped into his shoes, informing all who inquired after the previous proprietor of the ranch that he had bought out the Irishman and that the latter had gone to the lower country. This seemed a plausible story, but a discovery of human bones led to an investigation which has proved that the supposed lay preacher not only murdered the Irishman, but hacked the body to pieces and served it up in variously prepared dishes to the travellers stopping at his place. So, you can imagine reading that back home in your newspaper, 1866, and one of your relatives has gone out exploring the mines. Yeah, I think you'd be a little bit worried about that. I also love the little detail, I don't often mention this, but I love the little detail that he was imitating the Irishman, and I would love to imagine what his Irish accent was like. I'm imagining something like Richard Gere's Day of the Jackal impression. Oh, to-do. No, not great. So, yeah, okay, excellent. So when we're looking at these letters back home, they form a big part not only of a communication network, but also of funds going back and forth from Ireland, from America to Ireland as well. And remittances were a massive source of income for a very poor, very agriculturally backward and oppressed nation in Ireland, right? People in Ireland. During the 1870s and 1880s, we have what's called the Land War, which was a whole series of social upheavals to do with the tenants' rights, farmers' rights, and indeed led to a series of brief famines in the 1870s as well. And of course, the letter behind me is from Michael McGee in Leadville in 1879. And you can read it there for yourself. The report here is that people are dying in Ireland with the hunger. That's a mistake in the letter. There was a large sum of money collected here for the relief of Ireland, so yous will find in this letter the sum of £20. Let yous not be need of anything as long as I have it. Whether you want money, let me know. Whenever you want money, let me know, and you shall have it. While I have it, I think that some of them lads will do better in this country than they will there. And he leads on further, sort of emphasizing this idea that you might as well emigrate. That's what ends up occurring with this chain migration, is that news goes back to Ireland. Here is a place where we could get jobs. Here's a place where there's a community, where there are other Irish people from that locality that can support and sustain you, help you get to your feet. Indeed, people are coming all the way from Ireland, traveling directly on the transatlantic railroad as it's being built and just being shuttled all the way over to America. People from the Beara Peninsula, for example, they start coming over and directly head over. Once the mines close, and it's kind of an irony really, because the wealth of the copper mines in Butte actually lowers the price of copper worldwide, effectively closing the mines in West Cork. And the Irish see that there's a potential over in Butte, because who's in charge of an awful lot of the mines in Butte? Marcus Daly, a Cavan man. And a quote from a local priest there is that he would give no other man a job but an Irishman. Now that is too extreme, because Daly was happy to hire anybody who was skilled, but he definitely had a sympathy with the Irish, and the Irish knew that they could get a job at the Never Sweat or the Mountain Con at any stage. And of course all sorts of fraternal organisations pop up in Butte to support that Irish community. So just as a little sort of reference, letters are obviously, oh yes, actually I did want to reference this, excuse me. So there's also a little sting in the tail for when they're talking about the remittances, and this is in the McGee letters in 1883, which is that they're wondering what happened to the money that they sent home. He did not pick that money up from the roadside, nor at the, oh my goodness, and I have that transcribed, but I can't read it right now. He had to work hard for it, and I would like to know, I would like to hear what has become of it, right? So, you know, they're also aware that they're sending an awful lot of money back. What's going on? Now, farms were bought, other people were emigrated, the passage and the fare was often paid for other family members to come over to America, but still, there's an awareness there that, you know, what we're doing, we're sending back a lot of money. We would prefer maybe sometimes gratitude maybe to be expressed. So in the songs as well, there's an emphasis on this sort of on some of these sort of ideas. And when we're talking about gratitude and ingratitude, it's a very heavy word. In a way, the immigrant experience was actually one of ingratitude. Right? You're leaving your family, you're leaving your home. Kirby Miller's assessment that these were exiles, you know, being forced to leave, was sort of an expressed internalization of that understanding of how they could compartmentalize that ingratitude. So one of the songs recalls, excuse me, one song recalls the morning after an American wake, which was a unique Irish custom, where the emigrant was treated to their own funeral celebrations by the community on the night before their emigration. His mother said, Slán leat a Hamish, ní hilfor níos mó. Farewell, James, you will never come back. Now, the second part, this is a translation by Bruce Bowling, who translates it for Kirby Miller in his book, Immigrants and Exiles. But the second part of that phrase could actually be more accurately rendered as, you won't return anymore. Now, that statement takes on much greater significance because it implies that it's James himself who is the active participant in deciding not to return. The immigrant, therefore, carries that guilt deep within and expressed it very rarely. For while the Irish immigrant would ceaselessly talk and sing about Ireland, connect and participate in Irish American community and organisations, in short, do everything they could to retain the cultural allegiances while in the United States, including writing letters, sending remittances, repatriation remained extremely low amongst the Irish. Connections to Ireland through letters, remittances and song were a sort of penance for those who left. There's two further letters that I think I would like to just mention, if it's okay. And I think I actually jumped on beyond them. But one of them really cracks me up. It's Patrick Phelan. He's a man in Australia. He's a miner over in Australia, and he's an Irish immigrant. And he's writing to his sister over in, who's living in California, in Sonora. She went to Australia and married an Irish miner who died. She went over to California. She was on her own, the husband died while she was over in California, and she marries another Irishman. Now, the first Irish husband did quite well for himself. The second one is a man called Peter Meehan, and became very wealthy, very important figure in Sonora, California. And the letters that come from the family shift quite perceptibly when they learn that this second person was quite wealthy. I don't think the family knew how the first husband had done. But they get this letter in 1853. And it's referencing a sister, Teresa. Your sister Teresa is in America this 8 years, and during this time she has sent them home money several times. Your grandmother is fretting and crying every day, calling about not hearing from you, and if you should write home and send them a few pounds for your grandmother, an aunt loved you dearly. And I love the fact that they put in the middle, in between those both cries for like sending money. This person sent a lot of money. You should send money. There's the grandmother fretting and crying and acting up every day, which she may well have been, but I don't think there was a need to put it in between the call for money. Patrick Dunny also writes, since I left Ireland, I have a desire to return, and until I do, I believe I will never be contented. The only group in America, in the United States in the 19th century who had a lower repatriation rate were Jewish emigrants who left the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. And it's interesting that those two groups were also the most occupationally, economically successful when they arrive into America. Their struggle is quite interesting in that regard. And of course we can say that the Jewish and Irish populations were the two that suffered a diasporic migration, both the Irish with the An Gorta Mór, the Great Famine, and then, like I said, those pogroms that happened. Returning again back to those poems, I just wanted to reference another one as well, which is where we hear the line, Bheas chun capall a cheannach dom bháthar is uan. I was going to buy my mother a horse and a lamb as well. So the immigrant leaving has their own expectations about what it is that they're going to be able to do over in America. It's not simply this idea of, you know, America being this great land of riches. It's much more direct than that. It's enough to support themselves and to support back home. The obligation is there, as I was kind of pointing to earlier on. Back on track. So, when the Irish immigrants arrive, they arrive facing a whole series of adversaries. And as I mentioned early on, nativism was quite strong in the middle of the 19th century. There was a whole political party dedicated to it, the Know-Nothings, who were worried that the Irish were part of a vanguard papist takeover in America. Now, of course, this is incredibly, this is kind of preposterous from an Irish perspective for two reasons. Firstly, the Irish very much admired America as being the place that managed to split off from Britain a few hundred years before they managed to do it. And the second thing was that tens of thousands of Irish died for the United States at battles of, you know, Chancellorsville, Antietam, Gettysburg. And so, in a way, and this has been a point made by a recent historian, that the price of citizenship was paid by blood of those Irish immigrants that fought in this area. This picture up here is from Puck, and it's very interesting. You can see all sorts of racist tropes kind of popping out at it. The left group entering from San Francisco is Irish. You can see the hats and a little shamrock popping out in the corner, and of course he's carrying some sort of stick, presumably to clobber his opponents with, a little dudeen in his mouth. And up above his head is wanted immediately, a chance to work as alderman or coroner, and situation wanted as congressman. And then finally you got the liquor store wanted, right? But these positions are all permanent. They're embedded in America's political structure. These guys are here for good. And on the right, you have the Chinese immigrants coming in. Wanty, washy-washy for American man, and then wanty plenty money to take you home. Obviously the usual racist stereotyping there. But what is correct about that assessment is that the Chinese immigrants over in America are overwhelmingly male, and they are primarily directed towards getting Gamsam, Gold Mountain, and returning back to China. Very high repatriation rates. The Chinese Exclusion Acts, eventually that racist act that was brought in, ends Chinese immigration, but the Chinese immigration into America is not a permanent one like the Irish one. And even Puck, as racist as it is, understands that difference between them. We have come to stay, we are going home. So, this is another one that I really enjoy. And you can see there in the front, Uncle Sam. Now, one of the things about the Irish immigrants into America is that they are able to utilize that political machinery very quickly. Vote early, vote often. And that is due to the experience of political activism over the previous few decades in Ireland, where they're trying to get Catholics the right to vote, where they're trying to get land rights from the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, and of course agitating for Irish independence as well, or Irish home rule. In the front of the queue here, we have the ballot box, and we have a man who's half Irish and half American. The Irish American, that hyphenated idea. And of course, Uncle Sam, he's his back turned in disgust. He's looking back at them. He says, the hyphenated American, Uncle Sam, why should I let these freaks cast whole ballots when they are only half Americans? So, I'd like to tell you a story that's contained in the book, which is to do with you're thinking, this is the mid-19th century. These issues have obviously faded by the time we're talking about the end of the book. Woodrow Wilson is touring America, drumming up support for the League of Nations. This is after the First World War. And he's down in Arizona. And down in Bisbee, Arizona, he's addressing a group of primarily Irish-American and German-American miners. And the Irish-American, they realize that Woodrow Wilson is very much on the side of Britain, both at the peace talks over in Versailles, and he's refusing to allow the Irish delegation to enter and negotiate, and he has supported the old enemy. And so they start jeering him. Woodrow Wilson eventually gets fed up with this, and he turns to the crowd and he shouts out to them, I have always believed that any man carrying a hyphen in his name is carrying a dagger to stab into the vitals of this republic. Strong stuff. That question of identity, of what exactly it was to be American, or what it was to be Irish, or more important, what it was to be that contradiction and that negotiated Irish-American, was very much a great issue of tension in this period of America, both throughout the American West and then also, like I said, in the East Coast. But that battle being fought over whether or not you could be loyal to America and also loyal to the ideas that Irish had of America was kind of a question that was raised several times by people, including Woodrow Wilson. There we go. So, in Leadville, Colorado, there's a massive labor disturbance that takes place. Part of the Colorado labor wars, and Michael Mooney, who's leading the Irish labourers, and Irish are very heavily involved in trade unions, partly so that they can actually get better pay for themselves rather than some sort of broader workers' egalitarian identity. It's just much more, this is the way that you actually stand up for yourself and your group against these large mining companies. But Michael Mooney is in a public talk with George Daly, who is representing the mine owners' interests. And George Daly challenges Michael Mooney. He says, you're not really American, you're Irish, you're of questionable loyalty. Michael Mooney responds, I don't know that the whole American flag covers me, but I think I have a corner. It is cast in our teeth that this is an Irish movement. They say the Irish element is getting too strong. When our country's flag, the American, when our country's flag was assailed, was the Irish element too strong? And he's talking there about the tens of thousands of Irish that joined the Union Army during the Civil War. Now, that other figure, George Daly, and I suppose I'll start closing out with this. I have one last story for you, but I want to reference this. I have a little bit of time, and this has a quotation that I absolutely adore. So, that guy George Daly, when you're thinking of these WASPs, right, the white Anglo-Saxon Americans, the nativists, well, actually, a fair proportion of them are Irish. They're Scots-Irish, right? And they're so heavily embedded in this anti-Catholicism that they really do target those Irish Catholics, including Michael Mooney. George Daly was the son of an Irishman. He was born over in Australia, comes over to America, tries to make a name for himself as sort of a spokesman for mine interests and basically attacking those various union groups that are kind of popping up. His unfaltering support of business interests and dogged hostility toward trade unions and immigrants drew the attention of wealthy mine stock investors, who hired him as the mine manager in Bodie, California, and later in Leadville. The course of his business career seems like a desperate overcompensation for his uncertain credentials as an Anglo-American. He was an effective speaker, but ceaselessly antagonistic, and the Bodie Standard, which was sympathetic towards him, wrote that he was a born leader, but died with a myriad of enemies, all of his own making. However, the Homer Mining Index, which was an Arizona newspaper, had a slightly more comprehensive and robust critique. They wrote, "We wonder what kind of people those Leadvillians must be to worship this dirty little cub, whom every decent man in California and Nevada could not pass without an involuntary desire to kick him. He is a toady by nature, a scrub by instinct, and a bully on general principles, as all men of his stamp are. He is always ready to lick the boot of his superior, and is just as ready to kick one of an inferior position. His success shows what a man can obtain by sycophancy, cheek, and a willingness to do any sort of dirty work for his masters. He knows no more about a mine than a pig does about a blowpipe, and if he had not accidentally fallen in with men who need his debased services, he would have naturally become a pimp or a barkeeper in a cellar dive." Now, I mean, talk about keeping the powder dry, they just unloaded. Daly was awarded the position of mine manager, and I'm sure his associates found that a very useful position, but he began promoting promising prospects around the American West, including in New Mexico, and his antagonistic bluster finally clashed with reality after he led a posse of townspeople. This is a posse of townspeople who were leaving the local saloon, so that might give you context of how this decision was made. Posse of townspeople to hunt Chief Nana's Apache. The Apache ambushed his party, and Daly was the only fatality. His muted origins were hardly responsible for his death. Instead, his belligerent attitude, as seen in his dealings with the Irish-led Union, and that's primarily in Chapter 4, propelled him to his eventual foolhardy demise. I'm going to end with a wrap-up, and the last story is of Helena. And this, does anybody recognize this picture? Excellent. And so that's Mamie Cruz up on top of the pageant. She's the queen of the carnival, 4th of July. And her father was Thomas Cruz, Colonel Cruz, a man from Drumlummon over in Cavan, County Cavan in Ireland, who made his money finding gold. And with that, he built a cathedral up on the hill. Now, Helena in this period had the highest proportion of millionaires anywhere in America. And it was also a fairly strong bastion of anti-Irish belief. Some writers would like to term Butte was the black beating heart of Montana, right, because of its concentration of Irish. But definitely they didn't take too kindly to an Irish Catholic fella who managed to make it rich on maybe his last exploration ever and built a gigantic cathedral, Catholic cathedral up on top of the hill. So whether or not Thomas Cruz was accepted by the other people of society, like Clark, we will set aside. But I will say that that cathedral up on the hill, and this, seemed to me a very strong indication that he understood the importance of symbols. And I don't think it's any coincidence that she's called the Queen of the Parade. I think for an Irish-American woman, I think for an Irishman, putting her as the Queen is a fairly strong little sneer towards Britain. And I start the book talking about Nellie Cashman. She was an entrepreneur, a prospector, she owned hotels, and she was just one of these trailblazing sort of women that existed. Every 4th of July, or any American celebration, she would, or actually any British celebration, she would proudly hoist the American flag in sort of diffidence and opposition to anybody who might dare say that, you know, what is going on, or what it is what is her identity, what is her sort of acknowledgement. Very aggressive and hostile towards that conflation, I suppose we could put it very, very gently. The deep importance of being Irish, there was no way for the Irish to step away from that part of identity. You might as well have asked an Irish person to be English. It just didn't make sense. So for them, that negotiation of becoming Irish American was very much an integral thing, even though they were thousands of miles away from home. Those letters obviously sustained them, helped them, as did the local communities that are scattered all throughout the American West that existed back then. And finally, I suppose I'll end with the thought that the overt hostility to the Irish from nativists for refusing to be what they weren't, right, directed towards the Irish immigrants, I believe, and I think my work shows, that it helped America look at its reflection more clearly as it entered the 20th century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. We have some time for questions, so if anyone has a question for Alan, please raise your hand. I will bring you the mic, which is now working, and we will have you speak into it.
Can he reiterate what you just said?
Oh yeah, of course, yes. I suppose I was just simply sort of restating that the nativists focusing on the Irish, talking about, you know, the Irish refusing to be what they aren't, I thought, and I suppose I can quote from the book if that's okay. So, helping America look at its own reflection, and I think this is encompassed later on, it's towards the end of the book, so just give me 2 seconds.
And who was the woman who
Nellie Cashman. Yes, I include her at the start. There's also several other trailblazing women that I didn't really get a chance to talk about. Mother Jones is obviously one. She's very active throughout America. The song She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain speaks about her traveling to various states, being thrown out by Pinkerton detectives or various National Guard officers and making it back to the striking workers. Her phrase, Mother Jones, which is a Welsh nickname that an Irish woman uses in order to ingratiate herself with the diverse communities of miners in these mining towns, right? So she's speaking to Italians, she's speaking to Welsh, she's speaking to Irish, and she uses this affectation of being this elderly woman, and she'll kind of hobble up to the platform in the mining town, and all of the miners will be there, and they'll be debating whether to strike, they'll be debating whether to sustain the strike, they'll be debating what exactly they're going to do, and she'll kind of start off in her limited voice, and then, you know, she'll say, oh, I'm just an elderly woman just trying to, you know, but I know what my rights are, and her kind of voice will get louder, but look at you strong, powerful men, and you're not able to stand up for your wives, and your children, and yourselves, and the whiners will be crying tears and openly weeping, and she'll be, her famous phrase was, pray for the dead, but fight like hell for the living, which I think was a good phrase. But the quote, see, that's the danger with asking an Irishman a question. You might get an answer to a different question completely. But yes. So, the assessment, the shift that takes place in American society about how to really navigate that sort of thing between business, society, government, how exactly it's going to be worked, and the participation of trade unions, of course, later on, is encapsulated for me in the final report on the Commission on Industrial Relations. And I state here, this report stepped away from past political tendencies which had blamed immigrants for not seizing the supposedly self-evident opportunities politicians and business leaders presumed were inherently available in America and often were perceived to be there by immigrants. Instead, the report announces a new vision for the country, and in a startling departure, it stated, and this is in 1916, quote, with the inexhaustible natural resources of the United States, her tremendous mechanical achievements, and the genius of her people for organization and industry, there can be no reason to prevent every able-bodied man of our present population from being well-fed, well-housed, comfortably clothed, and from rearing a family of moderate size in comfort, health, and security. A vast departure from a few decades before, when the Irish were seen as a sort of papist infiltration. Anyway, I hope that answered it.
Other questions?
Sure.
So,
Oh, but
thank you.
So, were you suggesting that the Catholic Church really discouraged the people to immigrate to the United States, even during the famine, etc.?
No, my references were purely to the isolation of the American West in particular, is kind of where they're expressing their fears and their doubts. They're happy to encourage the Irish to go to New York, Boston, and Chicago. But of course, the Irish see opportunity in many different towns in the American West. And I'll give you a quick example. The most Irish town in America in 1870 is Virginia City, Nevada. The most Irish town in America in 1880 is Leadville, Colorado. The most Irish town in America in 1900 is Butte, Montana.
Butte?
Butte, Montana.
I understand that
You're
Butte
welcome.
paid the miners more than anywhere else in the U.S., and that's why they were coming.
I'm sorry, I actually didn't hear the start of your question.
I was told that the mines in Butte paid more than any other mine in the United States, and so their families would send them. You go straight to Butte.
Butte or bust, yeah. It's a twofold process. It's not simply the high wages. The high wages would be one thing. That would probably attract a substantial portion of Irish people. But it's also the fact that there are whole communities of Irish people there, that they know that the employer, the mine owner, is sympathetic to the Irish. And all we need to do is compare and contrast that with what happens in Idaho. There's a reason that I lead from chapter 5 to chapter 6, Idaho into Montana. In chapter 5, we have a massive confrontation that takes place in the Coeur d'Alene region between the largely Irish trade union and the mine owners. And the mine owners decide to import Italian workers. There's a common strategy of the mine owners throughout the American West. Well, the Irish get the great idea of recruiting the Italians into the trade union. So now it's a disaster. Now the trade union's even stronger. And one of the mine owners in, somewhere in Montana, I think it's not Marysville. Maybe it is Marysville. But Marysville, it might be, I'd have to double check. He writes to the mine owner who's about to hit out against the trade unions and blacklist any miner. He's writing over to him in Idaho. And he goes, talking about the possible strike, talking about whatever. And he ends his letter saying, I sincerely hope you teach the Irish a lesson they will not soon forget. He doesn't say, I sincerely hope you teach the miners, I sincerely hope you teach the trade unions. It's the Irish. He knows that the Irish are the core of that trade union movement, of that workers' solidarity and union. So it's twofold in the sense that pay is one aspect. It's important. Absolutely, but it's also the surrounding social circumstances too. Great question. Oh.
Go to the back, because I'm closer here first.
So, did the Irish bring over the concept of trade unions? I mean, was that a thing in Ireland? Which I'm surprised at.
So, great question. The reason that is such a good question is because what you have happening in the 19th century really is the genesis of trade unions. When we think of a trade union, we're like, how hard could it be? Workers organizing themselves. Well, that idea didn't really exist in the middle of the 19th century. Instead, what you had is sort of proto-guilds. The Knights of Labour now is one such example, where it was both a fraternal organization and also a skilled-based occupational group. And it was, in a way, more expansive than the guilds had previously been, but it was also still exclusionary. So this idea of a trade union representing all of the workers in a particular area was only coming to fruition. Now, where the Irish fit into this is, firstly, they understand how to engage in organizational structures. And their experience, again, as I was saying, with both political unrest in Ireland, with agitating for land rights in Ireland, helps them have the skills to understand how important that is over in America, much quicker than other immigrant groups. And so that's why you see an awful lot of the leaders in the 19th and early 20th century are Irish. John Mitchell, I mean, the list of Irish trade union leaders, I'll just be here for the next hour talking about them. But that initial early period when we're talking about the formation of trade unions, the Irish play an absolutely key role throughout the American West in organizing, leading, and then deciding what direction that they take. That can be true of more radical unions that you're talking about with the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, or it can be the more moderate Western Federation of Miners, or the later groups such as the AFL-CIO. So lots of different stuff going on there. Really interesting question, and one that I think is kind of dealt with in the book, but it's something I'm going down in the research route as well, because how exactly they figure out how to do it, and it's an area fraught with battles and complex difficulties.
Did you find letters from the Beara Peninsula immigrants, and did you find them in America or in Ireland or both, or can you get more explicit about that?
Yeah. So, historians have to eat, and it's unfortunately true. And it is a sad story that there are some applications that I've made to institutions in hopes that we could go collect what I think will be the last remnant of many of these letters. None of them have come true. So unfortunately, that collection process, which began with a scholar called Arnold Schreier, he collected dozens of immigrant letters in the 1960s, and Kirby Miller did that in the 1980s. There's been no such effort in the present, and I'm afraid that we've lost an awful lot of material that has just simply been thrown out, simply been forgotten. And so it's sad, but that's what happens when you don't allow historians to eat. Some of the letters that I have are from Cork, explicitly from Beara. It's mostly over in America that they're writing back. It's mostly in Butte that they're writing their notes, their letters, their documents. Ciara Ryan, Dr. Ciara Ryan, has worked a lot on Irish language, literature, and things like that, and encompassing details of that. Some of the real interesting scholars, I have some of them here in the appendices. I include references to them, but Sean Rochelle and Omar Hartig, Seamus Omar Hartig as well, are Irish language people that go to the mines over in Butte because there's such an Irish concentration, but they're not from West Cork. You know, they're from other areas, and so these migrant patterns, while I would absolutely love to have more material from exactly where it is that you're saying, some of it just doesn't exist anymore or has just been tossed out. So it's unfortunate. I'm working with a limited repertoire of whatever it is that I can find. And if I can have another 20 seconds on that point, I exhaustively searched archives and material throughout the American West, throughout Ireland, and I think I've pretty much hit whatever is out there, which again, I knew there was more material out there, but it just, there was nothing I could do about it. And every archive that is there that has Irish immigrant letters to look at, I think I've probably gotten to at this stage. But it's, yeah, there's a wealth of material to explore. I will end with the fact that Kirby Miller has generously donated his collection of immigrant letters to New York University, and so those are being digitized at present. And I think part of them are online, Ciara?
I think they're doing through Galway too.
Oh, that's correct. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so those should be online relatively soon. Yeah, they're an amazing source.
I think I'm loud enough. I just have a silly question. This is not.
No such thing.
This is not a good question, my curse. Just I'm curious from someone who studies such Irish American history, do you have your own opinion on how Thomas Marr died?
That's why I asked them to cut off before questions and answers, and they said, no, we're putting you on the spot, Alan. I have this...
Statues at our Capitol just down the street.
Absolutely. I have many discussions with David Emmons on this. Great love for the man. And he tells me the speed that the river was flowing when he toppled into it. And I'm like, that's all very interesting, David, but I'm afraid his last words were, they're going to kill me, they're going to kill me. And the fact that one of the leaders of the vigilante organization was in Fort Benton at that time. I think it's fairly likely. I'm 90% sure. You can never say one way or the other because there's always that speculation. But yeah, I think he was. And if not, there was definitely the intent to murder him. I mean, that's kind of more to the point too, as well, right? It's not like he made a whole lot of friends while he was acting governor. So yeah, I think The Immortal Irishman, great book. I don't think he goes far enough. He's kind of like, oh yeah, maybe, probably. I think, yeah, for me, it's like a Columbo episode. He just comes back, just one more thing. But
No, just there.
And is it true that that was in the book, I think, so the Irish flag, is that Thomas Marr?
That is,
Yeah.
yes, in Waterford. I give tours back in Ireland, and I go to Waterford, I give a tour in Waterford, and I go down to the house where he first flew that flag. It was with I wish I could remember, it's jumped out of my brain now, excuse me, with a French woman. He designed that flag. It's based on the French liberté, equality, fraternity. That idea is embedded in it, but of course, the more important meaning behind it is you have Catholics representing green, Protestants representing orange, and white representing peace and unity between the two factions. So it's a very potent, very important symbol. Yes, he was the first person to fly that flag, Master of the Sword. And if you ever want to read a really powerful speech, have a look at his sword speech. He gives it, and my goodness, he had a way with words. Yeah, have a read of it. It'll get your blood up for sure. It's long, but it's good. Thank you.
Could you just speak for a minute about the Irish coming and fighting in the Civil War and what happened with that?
So, some of the letters that I have looked at are, Damien Shields is a really good scholar who has focused an awful lot on accounting and detailing every Irishman who served in the Union Army. So he's done tremendous work on that front. The Irish experience of joining the Union Army wasn't always wholesale. We're completely in favour of this idea of the Union. An awful lot of them basically hopped off the boat. Into the army you go, sign your papers, head away in. But it is true that there is a tremendous fervour for the Union amongst the Irish that are living in America when the Civil War breaks out. And you can see that again through the Irish Brigade, which is one of the most decorated regiments in the American Army. Its bravery really doesn't need to bear repeating, but if you ever want to look at the First and Second Battle of Chancellorsville, Bloody Angle, Sunken Gulch, you know, these assaults by the Irish Brigade were incredible. They suffered vast casualties. The brigade had to be rebuilt several times because they lost so many people. And I believe, I'm open to correction, but General Lee, seeing that charge of the Irish up against this Bloody Angle, described the group as the bravest soldiers he had ever seen. So, high praise coming from him. The many Irish that served in the Union Army, and I've only done this tentatively, but there is indications that a chunk of veterans ended up settling in Montana after the American Civil War. And so if you want to look at a few of them, they're actually within the Progressive Men of Montana, which is a book that is online. And so a few Civil War veterans that are Irish are in there, and they're members of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the fraternal order that supported veterans after the Civil War. And actually, a side note, some of them did manage to go back to Ireland. There's several references in the 1901 census to American Civil War veterans as well, former soldier or US soldier. Quite interesting. I mean, there's so many stories to tell there that I really can't tell many more without taking up too much of your time. But it's a fascinating story. Thank you.
Alan, sending money is so important. You know, in the late 19th century, we don't have the sophisticated banking systems we have today. I was wondering, how was money sent home?
That is a great question. And it is actually to do with, I could only put it in like 1 or 2 paragraphs because there's some really interesting stuff there. But the Immigrant Savings Bank in New York is set up by the Irish. And it has several entries for gold miners who end up coming over and using the Immigrant Savings Bank in New York to send money back over to Ireland. Now, some of those immigrants did something rather interesting, which is that they've got this whole bunch of gold. What are they going to do with it? Well, they sew it into their boots and then make their way back over to the East Coast, deposit it in the bank, head back over prospecting again. There's a few accounts of people like that as well. Often it's in the form of, like I said, transportation notes. So your passage to America is paid for by the immigrant. And this banking structure that you're kind of imagining is actually only emerging at this stage. And a big reason that it does emerge is because the Irish are sending back such vast sums over to Ireland. Of course, it's a source of great apprehension amongst the British, because some of this money is definitely going towards not supporting the local farm, we could say, put it subtly. The 1916 Easter Rising doesn't occur without money from America. The War of Independence doesn't end in a negotiated settlement or a treaty in 1922 unless there is support from America. And there's a reason why Eamon de Valera spends an awful lot of his time during the War of Independence over in America. So America is a key part of this Irish diaspora, and my point in my book is that the American West is too. Great question.
Going off of that, so if they couldn't get to the bank, were they sending American dollars or gold coins, or what actually, if they couldn't get to the bank, what would they send?
Oh, they would get to the bank. They'd have to get to the bank to either convert it into pounds and send it back that way. The banks are usually working between themselves. They're sending back promissory notes, various types of bonds.
So all of these letters in which they were sending money back to their family from the West, they would go all the way across the country and go to that bank, and then...
That's exactly right.
Wow.
Yeah, these networks, I suppose when we look back at this period, we're kind of imagining a relatively unsophisticated sort of, like they're basically sending back gold bullion or sending back gold dust all the way back to Ireland. But what's somebody going to do with the gold in Ireland? Like, so there has to be the emerging structure that's sort of built in behind that in order to get these funds back over to Ireland.
And there wasn't a bank closer to San Francisco.
Oh, they emerged too. But the Immigrant Savings Bank is the anchor which these Irish immigrants start using, and they develop that. So they understand. So yeah, okay, you're absolutely right that this is the very early days. This is like 49ers, 50, 51, when, really California's population is down at like, 3,000-4,000. Next, it's 15,000 next year. Then it's 50,000. So like all of these structures start emerging fairly rapidly. In that very earliest days, that's an example that I was talking about. But the structures of finance, they emerge fairly quickly, because where there's money, you will find banks. Yeah, you're right. That was a pretty weighted statement.
Can you speak to the naturalization process, or how the Irish would have attained citizenship?
That is an excellent question. Compared to the bureaucratic systems and structures that we have these days, in effect what happened, an Irish person arrived into America. If they passed the immigration or the entering the country process, came into America, well then, a few months later you just went down and registered as an American citizen. That was it. You go to the Butte Silverbow archives and you just signed a little document down at the courthouse declaring that you were American, that you did not support a foreign potentate, which was the little part saying that you don't support the papish takeover of America, right? Because that was what the Irish were really focused on, not providing for their family, so very, very straightforward, very, very simple, and yeah, it's really the only check on the earliest immigration process in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Very limited checks for certain types of diseases, and they could refuse you entry at that later point, but really the earlier point they're arriving, and they're often arriving in very desperate straits, and it's more about making sure that they can live. We have terrible stories of those famine immigrants in the late 1840s and 1850s. Like I said, Ungurt the Moor, the Great Hunger, Gross Eel in Canada. Hundreds of Irish immigrants come off the boat and just die. They collapse. And so the suffering is difficult to imagine. They describe them as coffin ships, and while the conditions of those ships improved significantly by the 1860s, the 1840s and 1850s are a vicious and brutal time to try and be an Irish immigrant. And of course, I will add that the poorest of the poor in Ireland during the famine, they just died. Over 1.4 million, according to the assessment of one scholar in the famine period between 1845 and 1853, and another 2 million emigrated. within that decade period afterwards. I think the statistic, and Ciara might correct me on this, I think the statistic is that 1 of every 4 Irish people born on the island of Ireland in 1850 is living in America 10 years later. And huge numbers. The comparable rate for Germany is something like 1 in 20, 1 in 30, something like that. So America is a very important destination, and during that period in the 1850s, it truly is a diasporic, a forced migration period. Later on, it becomes much more to do with economic choice and sustained community and sustained links, but that earlier period is brutal.
I think that is a great point to end, so thank you very much for that wonderful talk.